April 11, 1945, marked the moment when the trajectory of the 20th century shifted on a muddy riverbank in central Germany. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General George S. Patton stood at the precipice of a decision that would either end World War II with a Western triumph in Berlin or surrender the heart of Europe to the Soviet Union. Why did the Supreme Allied commander clip the wings of his most aggressive general at the very moment of total victory? The spring of 1945 did not feel like a time for caution to the men of the Third Army. General George S. Patton, a man who lived for the friction of combat and the pursuit of historical destiny, watched his armored columns slice through the crumbling remains of the Wehrmacht like a hot blade. The Rhine was behind them, the heart of the Reich was open, and the ultimate prize, Berlin, was less than 50 miles from the leading elements of the American Ninth Army. To Patton, the war was a race, and the finish line was the Reichstag. He viewed the battlefield through the lens of a classic conqueror, believing that the capture of the enemy's capital was the only way to signal a definitive end to the madness of the Nazi regime. However, the view from SHAEF headquarters in Reims was dictated by a different set of maps. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the master of the Grand Alliance, was not looking at the speed of tanks, but at the weight of politics and the cost of human life. Eisenhower understood a reality that Patton chose to ignore. The Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, had already carved Germany into occupation zones during the Yalta Conference in February. Berlin sat deep within the designated Soviet zone. For Eisenhower, a professional soldier with the soul of a statesman, military objectives had to serve political ends. If American soldiers bled to take Berlin, they would only have to hand the city over to the Red Army weeks later. The logistical reality was even more haunting than the political one. The Red Ball Express and the massive supply chains that fueled the Allied advance were stretched to the breaking point. Every gallon of gasoline and every crate of K-rations had to travel hundreds of miles from the ports of France and Belgium. Eisenhower's staff warned him that a sustained drive into the urban nightmare of Berlin would require a massive redistribution of resources, potentially stalling the advance on other fronts. The specter of a national redoubt, a rumored Nazi fortress in the Bavarian Alps, where die-hard SS units might hold out for years, loomed large in Eisenhower's mind. He feared that while Patton chased glory in the ruins of Berlin, the Nazi leadership would slip away to the south to wage a relentless guerrilla war. On April 12th, the Ninth Army reached the Elbe River. General William Simpson, commander of the Ninth, telephoned General Omar Bradley with a simple request. "We're at the Elbe. Can we go on to Berlin?" The answer that came back was a cold, decisive no. Bradley, acting on Eisenhower's direct orders, commanded the troops to halt. The American soldiers, some of whom could see the glow of Berlin on the horizon at night, were forced to dig in and wait. This order sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of the military. To Patton, this was more than a tactical error. It was a betrayal of the men who had fought from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. The friction between Eisenhower and Patton represented the fundamental tension of the Allied command. Patton believed in total war, the complete destruction of the enemy's power and the occupation of their symbolic heart. Eisenhower believed in sustainable victory, the preservation of the alliance with the Soviet Union, and the minimization of Western casualties. Eisenhower's declassified cables to the War Department reveal a commander who was deeply concerned about the prestige of taking Berlin versus the utility of it. He famously noted that Berlin was nothing but a geographic location that had lost its strategic importance as a command center. But was Berlin truly just a geographic location? To Joseph Stalin, the city was the ultimate trophy, a symbol of the Soviet Union's sacrifice and its new status as a global superpower. While Eisenhower issued orders to halt at the Elbe, Stalin was launching Operation Berlin, a massive offensive involving over 2 million men and thousands of tanks. The Soviet dictator did not share Eisenhower's concerns for zones of influence when it came to the actual fighting. He wanted the city at any cost. This disparity in intent would define the final weeks of the war. As Patton's Third Army was diverted toward Czechoslovakia and Austria, the general's frustration reached a boiling point. In his private diaries, Patton recorded his disdain for the political generals who he believed were handing Europe to the communists on a silver platter. He saw the Red Army not just as an ally of convenience, but as the next great threat to Western civilization. Patton's rhetoric became increasingly inflammatory, leading to heated exchanges with Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander, however, remained unmoved. He had a war to finish and a peace to manage, and he would not let Patton's aggressive tactical momentum shatter the fragile Grand Alliance before the guns had even fallen silent. The American soldiers on the Elbe spent their days watching the eastern horizon. They saw the massive artillery flashes of the Soviet advance and heard the distant roar of the Katyusha rockets. For many of these men, the halt was a relief, a chance to survive the war. But for others, there was a sense of unfinished business. They had been told for years that the goal was the heart of the Reich, and now with the prize in sight, they were told to stand down. The tactical pause at the Elbe was the first physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, a line drawn in the dirt by a commander who prioritized the future over the present. Eisenhower's decision was also influenced by the fear of friendly fire incidents. With two massive, non-communicating armies converging on a single point from opposite directions, the risk of a catastrophic accidental battle between the Americans and the Soviets was high. By establishing the Elbe and the Mulde rivers as a clear line of demarcation, Eisenhower created a safety buffer. He was determined that the end of World War II would not be the beginning of World War III through a tragic misunderstanding on the battlefield. In Moscow, Stalin played a masterful game of deception. He assured Eisenhower and the Western Allies that Berlin was no longer a major objective for the Red Army, even as he ordered Zhukov and Konev to race toward the city at top speed. This great lie reinforced Eisenhower's belief that he could afford to wait at the Elbe. It was a strategic masterstroke by the Soviet leader, exploiting the Western commander's professional integrity and desire for a coordinated end to the conflict. The diplomatic cables between London and Washington during this period show that Winston Churchill was terrified by Eisenhower's decision. Churchill begged Eisenhower to reconsider, arguing that the capture of Berlin by the Western Allies would provide crucial leverage in post-war negotiations with Stalin. Churchill understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the liberation of Eastern Europe by the Red Army would lead to a permanent occupation. But Eisenhower, supported by General George Marshall in Washington, insisted that military decisions must remain free from political interference. An irony, given that his decision was perhaps the most political of the entire war. By mid-April, the die was cast. The American Ninth Army and Patton's Third Army were redirected, leaving a vacuum in the center of Germany that only the Soviets would fill. The aggressive tactical momentum that had characterized the Allied breakout from Normandy was officially quelled. This was the moment the Great Crusade transitioned into a logistical and administrative operation. The war of movement was over. The war of occupation had begun. Patton's intelligence officers continued to feed him reports about the Soviet advance. He watched with a mixture of professional respect and deep ideological dread as the Red Army bypassed German units to encircle Berlin. He knew that the maps being drawn in the drawing rooms of Yalta were being written in blood on the streets of the German capital. Every day he spent in the Bavarian countryside was, in his eyes, a day wasted. He began to envision a future where the American army would have to fight the very allies they were currently waiting for. The psychological toll on the leadership was immense. Eisenhower was navigating the deaths of President Roosevelt and the immense pressure of coordinating with the temperamental Charles de Gaulle and the demanding Churchill. He was a man holding a crumbling world together with sheer force of will. Meanwhile, Patton was a man watching his world, the world of clear-cut military victory, disappear in a haze of diplomatic compromise. The Allied armies sit frozen on the banks of the Elbe. The path to Berlin is open, yet forbidden. The shadow of the Soviet colossus grows longer by the hour. But what happened when the first American and Soviet patrols finally met? And did the national redoubt that Eisenhower so feared actually exist? Or was it the greatest intelligence failure of the war? The answers would determine the fate of millions in the boundaries of the Cold War. The silence at the Elbe was broken on April 25, 1945, when a small patrol from the 69th Infantry Division encountered Soviet troops near Torgau. This handshake at the Elbe was celebrated in newsreels as a moment of supreme brotherhood. But behind the cameras, the tension was palpable. For General Patton, these images were a facade. He saw the rugged, battle-hardened Soviet soldiers not as brothers in arms, but as a medieval horde that had been invited into the heart of Europe. As the Soviets began their horrific assault on Berlin, the true cost of Eisenhower's decision began to emerge. The Battle of Berlin would become one of the bloodiest urban engagements in history. Stalin's commanders, Zhukov and Konev, competed for the glory of reaching the Reichstag, driving their men into a meat grinder of German resistance. The city became a graveyard for hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Eisenhower watched from a distance, justified in his belief that he had saved American lives, yet haunted by the reports of the atrocities occurring within the Soviet sector. General Patton's focus shifted to the National Redoubt in the south. Intelligence reports suggested that Hitler, Himmler, and Goering intended to flee to the Alpenfestung, Alpine Fortress, to lead a werewolf resistance movement. Patton's Third Army raced into Bavaria and Austria, capturing Salzburg and moving toward Linz. What they found, however, was not a fortified mountain bastion, but a disorganized mass of retreating soldiers and terrified refugees. The National Redoubt was a phantom, a product of Nazi propaganda and Allied intelligence over caution. The realization that the Alpine Fortress was a myth hit Eisenhower hard. He had justified halting the drive to Berlin partly to ensure the destruction of this southern stronghold. Now it was clear that the resources diverted to the south could have easily secured Berlin weeks before the Soviets arrived. This revelation added fuel to Patton's fire. The general argued that the Western Allies had been outmaneuvered not by German arms, but by their own fears and Soviet deception. By early May, Patton's forces had reached the outskirts of Prague. Again, the order came from Eisenhower. Do not enter the city. Wait for the Soviets. Patton was furious. He knew that the Czech resistance was fighting for its life against the remaining SS units in the city. To stand by while a European capital was liberated by the Red Army was to Patton an act of moral cowardice. He famously asked his superiors if he should lose a few stars and just take the city anyway. But the discipline of the chain of command held, barely. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims. The war in Europe was over, but for the men on the ground, the peace felt like a cold, uncertain dawn. The division of Germany was no longer a plan on a map. It was a reality of checkpoints, barbed wire, and shifting populations. Patton, appointed as the military governor of Bavaria, found himself in a role he detested. He was a warrior forced to be a bureaucrat, and his lack of diplomatic tact soon became a liability for Eisenhower. The post-war friction between Eisenhower and Patton intensified as the scale of the Soviet occupation became clear. Patton's advocacy for a hard line against the Soviets, including the suggestion that the U.S. should use the remaining German prisoners of war to help push the Red Army back to its borders, was seen as madness in Washington. Eisenhower, tasked with maintaining the peace and overseeing the demobilization of millions of American GIs, saw Patton as a loose cannon who threatened to ignite World War III before the smoke from World War II had cleared. In the summer of 1945, the Potsdam Conference finalized the borders that Eisenhower had respected at the Elbe. The world was now divided into spheres of influence. Berlin, though deep in the Soviet zone, was divided into 4 sectors, creating a Western island in a communist sea. This precarious arrangement would lead to the Berlin airlift, the Berlin Wall, and decades of nuclear tension. Critics of Eisenhower's Elbe halt point to this as the inevitable result of his refusal to take the city when he had the chance. However, military historians often defend Eisenhower by pointing to the sheer exhaustion of the American public. In 1945, the United States was still fighting a brutal war in the Pacific. The prospect of an additional 100,000 casualties in the streets of Berlin was politically unthinkable. Eisenhower's primary responsibility was to the American people and the soldiers under his command. To him, the political leverage Churchill sought was not worth the lives of the boys from Ohio or Kansas, who had already given so much. Patton's tragic end in December 1945, a low-speed car accident in Mannheim, robbed history of its most vocal critic of the Elbe decision. Had Patton lived, his memoirs and political influence might have shaped the early Cold War narrative differently. Instead, his death silenced the war eagle, just as the Iron Curtain was falling across the continent. Eisenhower went on to become president, where he would manage the very Cold War he had helped set the stage for during those fateful weeks in April. The Patton versus Eisenhower debate remains one of the most studied leadership dilemmas in military history. It is a conflict between the tactical imperative, Patton, and the strategic reality, Eisenhower. Patton looked at the enemy in front of him. Eisenhower looked at the world behind him. One saw a city to be conquered. The other saw a peace to be maintained. Both were right in their own spheres, but only one could hold the ultimate authority. We must also consider the Soviet perspective. For the Red Army, Berlin was the lair of the fascist beast, After losing over 20 million people, the Soviet soldiers felt a biological need to be the ones to crush the heart of Nazism. Had Eisenhower attempted to take Berlin, it is highly likely that a direct, violent confrontation with the Red Army would have occurred. The Great Alliance was held together by the common enemy. Without Berlin as a buffer, the two giants might have clashed in 1945, changing history in ways we can only imagine. As we look back at the maps of 1945, the lines at the Elbe remain as a testament to the power of a single decision. Eisenhower's no to Patton changed the geography of Europe for 45 years. It preserved the lives of countless American soldiers, but surrendered half a continent to decades of totalitarian rule. It was a decision made in the fog of war, under the pressure of global politics and the weight of logistical survival. The ghost of Patton still haunts the history of the Elbe. His belief that the U.S. should have finished the job resonated during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Meanwhile, Eisenhower's pragmatic restraint became the blueprint for American containment policy. The two generals, so different in temperament and vision, together defined the American century. The ruins of Berlin were eventually rebuilt, and the wall that grew from the Elbe decision eventually fell. But the questions remain. Was the halt at the Elbe a brilliant act of statesmanship that avoided a premature World War III? Or was it a strategic blunder that allowed the Soviet Union to dominate Eastern Europe? The archives are open, the memoirs are written, but the verdict is still in the hands of history. The legacy of April 1945 is a reminder that in war, the most difficult battles are often fought not with guns, but with pens and maps in the quiet rooms of command. General Eisenhower and General Patton gave us two different versions of victory. One was glorious and fleeting, the other was painful and enduring. Which one would you have chosen? If you were in General Eisenhower's position in April 1945, would you have risked 100,000 American lives to take Berlin before the Soviets? Or would you have made the same choice to stop at the Elbe? Let us know your strategic reasoning in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.